This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. For our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andy Root. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp. In this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined once again by Andy Root. For those of you who didn't listen to the first episode, Andy is the Carrie, Olson, Baalson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Lately, his work has centered around the intersection of faith and our secular age, having completed his 6-volume series, Ministry in a Secular Age. Like I said, he lives in St. Paul with his wife, Carrie, who's a Presbyterian minister, and they have 2 kids, Owen and Maisy, and a dog. When he's not teaching and writing, he watches a ton of TV. So thanks again for joining me again, Andy. It's always love your work, and it's always look forward to having a conversation about it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Andrew. It's great to be back.
Yeah. So since we last talked, you've been busy publishing 3 more books in the span of 2 years. You've written Evangelism in an Age of Despair, A Pilgrimage into Letting Go, which, is a parent-pastor resource, and then most recently, Baal and the Gods of More. And so I'm curious, after 6 volumes of Ministry in a Secular Age, like, what were you hearing? Like, you obviously saw something, we're hearing things, conversations with pastors and churches and leaders, like, what precipitated these new works?
Yeah, well, first, sickness probably did it. Like, I'm a bit insane, so or masochistic maybe. I don't know how you feel about writing, Andrew, but I feel like it's a form of suffering. So I don't know if it's been like a little bit of Stockholm syndrome or something, where I've just been locked in this office writing so much, I can't stop. So I just have become friends with my captor. But actually, coming to the end of the 6 volumes of Ministry in a Secular Age, the truth is like the evangelism book and this Baal book really could be volumes 7 and 8 in that, but we had lied to all of the readers at the beginning, saying it was going to be 3 volumes. That ballooned to 6 volumes. So It just felt like Jeremy Wells at Baker and I just felt like, I don't think we can get away with like volume 7 and 8 and 9 and who do you think you are, Karl Barth? Which is I don't. So we had to stop at 6, though. They really kind of function the same way.
No, they do, and I want to start with your latest book, Baal and the Gods of More, because I think it provides a framework for even to think about the evangelism book. And so, in that book, you're really asking the question of what does it mean to grow? And so help, unpack a little, because I think churches all say, we're about growth, but you're wanting to very carefully nuance and point out some dangers.
Yeah, and I think the first step is to say that a lot of my work could be interpreted, or maybe some who would have pushback are like that this guy's anti-growth, or even like in economic theory, like especially in Europe, there's like a degrowth category where people are trying to look at like economies that not only don't grow, but what it would mean to kind of degrowth so I've been accused, not by a lot of people, but a few people, of being like the degrowth church guy, and I don't really want that. I don't really want that stigma. I'm really not about degrowth, but I am worried about the certain kind of forms of growth, or just kind of assuming that all growth is the same kind of growth. And I do think that there's something essential about the Christian tradition, that Christianity, that the call into following Jesus Christ, that what it means to live in God's kingdom has a sense of growth to it. But that so easily becomes kind of co-opted by a certain kind of late capitalist form of escalation, really. And so I'm trying to draw a distinction between what we really mean by growth. And probably the shorthand for that is I do think the Christian tradition is about growing into someone as opposed to growing something. And I just continue to find that Protestant churches like fail to draw that distinction, or to say like resource growth, membership growth, that could happen and God could bless us with that, or God could give that to us and it could be a curse. We just presume that that's a good in and of itself, but people will tell stories of their churches, exploding in growth and it actually destroying the church, that it becomes like a cancerous form of growth. And so I do think there's an ultimate good as growing into being like or being in and participating in the very life of God. But that doesn't necessarily mean budgets grow. That doesn't necessarily mean membership rolls grow, though they might. And we should celebrate that if that's the work of the Spirit. But I'm trying to give us an aim towards, something more theological than just purely mathematical, maybe. I don't know. Purely kind of quantified by the ways we usually count things, or are framed to kind of count things in our late modern age.
I think maybe your book resonated deeper with me because I'm in sales. I sell wine.
Mm.
And so if your sales aren't increasing, there's a strong business problem. And so it's easy to get trapped into that capitalist mindset. Like if there's not growth, something's wrong, we need to fix it, and that push for ever more growth, like in sales, like it's tiring, it's exhausting, are you visiting new accounts? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And it's so easy then to get stuck, just easily transfer that to the church of like, well, if we're not growing, there's something wrong with us, because that's how just our minds work.
Right.
And yet you point out that like, hey, we're either caught in this dichotomy of, do we want the child in Mary's arms, or, your blunt quote, or do we want Artemis and her mini teats? Like, and you have pictures in your book, like, and it's a very, but like you point out that like we're drawn to this fertility notion versus a relational model of growth that plagues us.
Yeah. And I think that is the big contribution of the Christian tradition, or sits at the heart of the Christian tradition, is that this growth is fully a relational dynamic. It is growing into Jesus Christ, who gives us our life, or it is growing into, when we look at the kind of iconography of the Christian tradition, it's growing into this embrace of the mother and the child, which is a very different kind of growth. There's no mother who doesn't want her child to grow. I mean, right. every mother, every parent wants their child to grow. And you'd be a pretty bad parent if you were like, you'd be a diabolical parent if you're like, well, I don't want my kid to grow. Or even taking the beauty of like, I love my daughter that she's 6, and thinking, I used to have this joke with my daughter, who is now almost 20 years old, but I always said that I had some professor I knew, some chemist, that could just inject her with some kind of serum that she would never grow beyond 6, because I just enjoyed her at that age. And it was a fun joke, but there was no stopping it. And I actually, if I could find that serum and give that to her, it would be abusive. I would do something that would be awful to her. So there is a sense of growth in that, but I also am not thinking I'll only be proud of her if she, has more resources or more degrees or more Instagram followers than all the other kids in the neighborhood or something. Like, I'm not just trying to get her to escalate and win every competition. I want her to grow into a fullness of life. So I do think that there are these logics that go all the way back to the ancient tradition, like you were mentioning. And this is how this kind of project was born for me, is being in the Vatican Museum and, seeing in the Hellenistic wing Artemis of Ephesus, who's got, she's got this kind of, I don't know, like this strong view on her face. She's almost kind of looking at you. And I won't want to say sinister, but it's very clear she has power. Right. And her arms are open, and she's just is kind of covered in all of these breasts, all these teats. And she's essentially will give you fertility if you give her worship and give her all your energy. She will kind of give you the resources you need. And then you go down the hall, turn the corner, go into the Renaissance art wing, and see all these beautiful pictures of the Madonna and the Child. And, as a Protestant in itself, that's, that's an awakening. But there is something really there's a complete difference here of a God that demands energy and more kind of escalation to receive goods from this God as a fertility God, or the God of Israel, the God made known in Jesus Christ, the God that Mary is called in the Magnificat to care for and to mother, is this God who wants the relational over escalation, and so try to drive our churches in that direction.
Right, because that picture that you share and the statue that you saw, it's not pornographic. Like there's meant to be something economical and even religious about it, versus a pornographic image that we're like, shy away from kids.
Right. There's no kind of titillation in it at all. No. I mean, it is this kind of forcefully, like, she provides you. There's a transactional reality. You give, your sweat, your blood, whatever kind of form of worship that is, and at least these statues of Artemis are very much this kind of. I'm not an Artemis expert, Near East religious expert. So maybe someone will be like, well, actually, in this oracle, she's very kind of compassionate. I don't know, but the statue, for the most part, and we see this in First and Second Kings with the fertility god Baal, where it just demands more and more acceleration of action, which is one of the interesting dynamics with Elijah, where Elijah kind of mocks them in the battle with the Baal priests. It's like, maybe you should be louder. Maybe you should dance harder. And we kind of get this mocking, cartoonish sense that he lays back and sleeps. But there's also a theological dynamic in this, that the God of Israel does not demand more and more escalating effort, because this is just like Egypt. Right. That's what Egypt demanded of you, that you would work harder, that you would do all this for those Egyptian fertility gods, essentially, and for the Egyptian empire. This God rescues you from that to make you not cogs in a fertility machine, but makes you children. And children are always invited into God's goodness and rest. And so Elijah cannot take mixing together Yahweh and Baal. He thinks these are two completely different logics, two completely different economic systems, if you will, that cannot cohere together. And I guess I wonder if we're at a point where we get a little bit tempted towards fertility, or that becomes more captivating in Protestantism right now, even though we wouldn't call it Baal. But our certain kind of capitalist forms are more attractive to us in certain levels than these. I don't know, than the ways of Israel, the ways of Yahweh to Israel, and the ways of the mother and the child.
Because I was also thinking of Brueggemann's book, Sabbath as Resistance. Because that's what his whole point is. Like, Sabbath is this resistant posture to an economy of escalation and the economy of more and more. And yet, like, the pull, whether back in the Israelites' day or in our day, is always back to escalation and more. And we think we're in this new age where it's different than what the biblical authors ever faced. But you in a very great way of highlighting First and Second Kings, you're drawing some deep correlations between the church and Israel. And so, like, it's obviously a big work, right? And it's too much to summarize in a 45-minute conversation, but like, help us see the parallels, or like, just because I think it gives us a situatedness that maybe we can be open and receptive to the God who speaks.
Yeah. Well, you've already mentioned Brueggemann's name, and it's very much a kind of Brueggemann read. So it comes with all the advantages of that and disadvantages of that. And I'm not I'm not an Old Testament professor, nor do I play one on TV. So, there's I'm sure a lot of lacuna in my read, but I go with Brueggemann in this sense where I guess I just say that to the listener. Like, it's very much Brueggemann's read of First and Second Kings is very much a priestly read, or excuse me, it's very much a prophetic read over and against the priestly read. And so, I'm trying to look at this in a more contemporary way of thinking about how certain ways we think about capital get escalated, and building off the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who he's talked about, your society actually is modern. Back to your selling wine, like, you're modern when you maintain or sustain your society by growth. So the wine business, your company, is only sustainable if it keeps moving product. Like, that's just the way it works. And in many ways, you have to keep moving beyond what you moved last year. You need to move more this year. So he calls that the dynamic stabilization, where he thinks your society's modern when it stabilizes itself by growth.
Hmm.
And I do not think you can impose that on the ancient world. Like the ancient world did not think we have to grow markets and therefore our society
Right.
will be stable. But every human society and every human collective has to stabilize itself, has to wonder, how are we going to exist across time? How are we going to exist that way? And I think in the ancient Near East, there was an escalation logic. It wasn't a dynamic stabilization, but the escalation logic was the bringing together of cultic systems. So it was a kind of cultic escalation. And so this is, how First Kings starts, is that we're told that David is the king, and this is a prophet's tale. So the prophet loves David.
Yeah.
David is the great king. He's essentially the king who is a prophet. And what's really fascinating from the prophet's perspective is David's a good king because David doesn't have a cult. He has no cult, no temple. And his only cult is a kind of soft cult, which is just prayers. He just has
Yeah.
psalms. There's not an intricate kind of cultic system with all these big temples that would reflect anything like Egypt. Like if you even today do a trip down the Nile, you just go from huge temple to huge
Mm.
temple to huge temple. Like the Nile was just littered with all sorts of incredible cultic systems, and David doesn't even have, in his own city, doesn't even have a temple in it. But then Solomon comes about, and he does.
Right.
Solomon becomes the great king, and you kind of get this feel from the prophet in the first chapters of First Kings, is like a little bit worried about Solomon because he does some crazy things, but you cannot deny this is golden era. Like this
Right.
is the golden time for Israel. Like they are the top dog, and these are great times. And so we are told Solomon is like his father David. He does this and that, but then we're also told these things like he also burnt a lot of offerings in high places, and he did marry an Egyptian princess and bring her into David's city. And the idea of that, of course, is when you marry, the wife brings in the cultic system of the other land, because it makes the king more powerful then, because then you have more gods to provide for your people. And so the idea that I'm trying to get at here, that maybe more than just the exegetical points, is that I think in First and Second Kings, Israel's on the downside of a golden era. And in a sense, you're getting every king after Solomon is trying to get back to this golden era and feeling the kind of pull down the other side of it. And I just kind of feel like that's where American Protestantism is. Like we are on the downside of a golden era. The mid 20th century was a golden era for American Protestantism. And when you're on a downside of a golden era, you get very tempted towards trying to mix together things that can't be mixed. Mix together Yahweh and Baal, mixed together late form growth capitalism and Protestant Christianity of the theology of the cross. You know what I mean? Like prosperity gospel and Paul's epistles. Like these things don't really kind of go together, but we feel like we have to. Or Silicon Valley based kind of innovation capitalism mixed with with this sense of the biblical text. These things don't all go together, but we feel tempted to try to find them. And that's really how I read the Ahab story, which is kind of, I think, the epic story of the two Kings books. Is it really is, Jezebel is not, I mean, we say this in Christianity, in kind of Christian culture, like Jezebel is the sexual temptress, and she's not that. I mean, that's unfair. She's an MIT, Harvard trained economist. And what she's brought in to do is to try to give the Northern Kingdom a economic boost. Like that's her thing. Like she brings in those cultic realities, but they're supposed to bring Israel on this downside, some kind of economic growth. And this is what Elijah just can't stand. He just cannot. He just does not think Yahweh and fertility gods, these are not things that go together. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. But really say that the temptation is always there when you feel on the downside of a golden era. And I think that's where we are in Protestantism.
Right, because you situate, the first half of the book is really situating the church in the post 1970 or this post Christian or America's special century, which the GDP growth, and what we saw, the economic growth. And you even point out that in times of economic growth, the church grew faster and better, I guess, than in slower GDP times. And so
Yeah, it's a crazy American phenomenon that for some reason it's not as true in Europe. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't have statistics say in the Southern Hemisphere, but I think it's a very true American phenomenon when GDP growth goes up and people have a sense that their standard of living is expanding, they go looking for a Protestant church. I mean, it's a very bizarre thing. And so, like from the mid 1950s, essentially till the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, there was just incredible amounts of GDP growth. And it led to really full churches. And so most pastors didn't even have to think about growth because it just happened, you know?
Yeah. And in that post time, and then, in the 80s and 90s, we saw mainline decrease, but evangelicalism, American evangelicalism maybe grew in different ways, and, but I think post 2000, I think, there's a decline and everybody's feeling it. And you even point out that the anxiety and unhealthy nostalgia for golden times is too much for many people. And like, I've felt that. Like I've talked to other people and I've mentioned, I'm like, I don't know what American exceptionalism is. Like, because post Columbine, really, like, I think, there's not, yes, we've seen some economic growth, but it's not that sustained GDP growth you point out. And so like, but for boomers or late Gen Xers, like they're holding on to something and craving something that's not there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm basing my economic theory on this kind of God bless him, but curmudgeonly guy named Robert Gordon, who wrote this really thick book. And Andrew, we've talked enough now on this podcast. I'm addicted to really thick books. So if it's a thick book like 600 pages, I may be interested in it. I'm the only person in the world who's drawn to that. But he has this big thick book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth, and I find it just fascinating. But that's his point, is that from 1870 to 1970 was an unprecedented time of GDP growth in America. And so he calls this the special century. And he particularly calls it special because he doesn't think it's coming again. Like it's more than likely not happening again. Like this was an outlier. And it was amazing. Like the GDP growth that happened in the mid 1960s, basically in like 3 years, you got more standard of living growth than you would get 100 years in the medieval period. So they have like a mathematical equation they can kind of push back. And it's like, this is why people thought the Jetsons was just a documentary, in the mid 1960s. Like, of course, we'd all be living on the moon and back and forth to Mars by 2025, because just things were, I mean, I guess another example of this is like Back to the Future. It worked because 55 and 85 were so different in kind of standard of living, but 85 and 15 were not that different. You know what I mean? Like that was going around social media. Like this is the same amount of time has passed as supposed to have passed in those 30 years of Back to the Future. Now 30 more years have passed, and we're still in puffy vests. We're still driving cars. We're listening to our music differently. We don't have cords around our ears. You have cords around your ears. You're mature and cool. But there's some ways that entertainment has changed. But for the most part, the larger infrastructures of our roads and the way we get food and things like that, like other than like the way Instacart works or something, it's pretty much the same. And I think it's debatable if that's better. Like we just ordered a pizza for the first time in a while, and now you have to go online. You have to download an app. You have to put your information in. It's like, I remember in 87, I could just call up the pizza place and like pepperoni, and it would be there in 30 minutes. And now I order online. I can do it on an app, and it takes 45 minutes to get here. So is it better? I don't know. I know they can harvest my data through doing it. So that's his basic point, is that since 1970s, that's been over. But I think my contribution is to try to tie that together with the Christian century, which is really the Protestant century. And I think it's really interesting how the Christian century, the Protestant century, and the special century are interconnected. And I think one of the things we're dealing with is what's fascinating is that in the midst of the special century and the Christian century, Protestants because of our heritage, we get uncomfortable with things going well. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like when things go well, we start to wonder, I mean, maybe legitimately we start to think, have we fallen into some kind of disobedience here or whatever?
Right.
So you see these moments where Protestants kind of disestablish themselves, you know? So after this kind of big missional movement, kind of world Christianity kind of movement and bringing civilization to the world through Protestantism, you get the social gospel that kind of disestablishes that. And then after World War II, you get this very congregational ministry kind of focus, and where the pastor is the important person in town. You get the kind of civic religion reality. And then the late 1960s disestablishes that.
Right.
And what happens is that it never gets reestablished. Like there's not an economic bump that allows for something to get reestablished. So the first two industrial revolutions, steam and electricity, were amazing for mainline Protestants. But then this third one came late, and when it came, it did not bring the growth that we thought it was. And this is what he thinks the third industrial revolution was: the microprocessor, was the computer. But it hasn't brought huge GDP growth. It's changed the way we get entertainment, but that's about it. It hasn't really changed transportation. It hasn't really changed how we get our food and our clothes and things like that. I mean, obviously we get Amazon and stuff like that, but for the most part, it hasn't radically changed it. Where if you had grown up in the 1850s and you made it to the 1930s, I mean, it was shocking how different the world was, you know?
Because, you mentioned it. The only thing the microchip has changed is our entertainment. It hasn't helped our productivity, and everybody feels it, right? Like, you know, my smartphone hasn't done anything to help me except waste my time and draw me into, you know, pits of despair, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, to Gordon's point, and, you know, this is beyond what I really completely understand, to be completely honest, but GDP is connected to worker productivity. Now we could wonder, is that good at all? But the point is that being able to stream every movie ever made on your phone is not really great for productivity. But having electricity or indoor plumbing, incredible for productivity. You know, so instead of having to, you know, carry in dozens of jugs of water from the well every day to have to turn a faucet, that really changes home productivity, you know, and adds to our standard of living. And so Netflix has given us every piece of entertainment, but it hasn't made that easier, but it hasn't really made our lives that different, besides being able to numb ourselves maybe a bit.
More, and not have to be tied to a VCR, make sure we hit record at just the right time. And if
right,
you know, if it's a sporting event, do we have to extend the recording to make sure we don't, you know, not get the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter, like, you know, and then fast forwarding through commercials, like, you know, my daughters will complain like that. Wait, we can't fast forward through commercials, and I'm like, no, this is live.
Or trying to explain to them like what it was like to watch Seinfeld at the heyday of it, when like everyone was watching it. And if you missed one of the episodes, unless you had set your VCR, if you missed one of the episodes, you just had to wait till summer and there was a rerun, you know?
Yeah. And then catch it at the right time and find, you know,
catch it at the right time.
Go through your TV guide booklet, you know, and find it, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was a great pleasure in the summer when all of a sudden you turn it on and be like, I've never seen this episode.
Right.
Like you forgot that you missed an episode. You're like, oh my gosh, it felt like an incredible gift.
Yes. And so, but what did change in that third industrial revolution is sort of the identity aspect. You unpack that in other books of like, we are an identity-based culture looking for more clicks. And I think pastors and churches, I think, find themselves in that, where pastors are trying to establish their identity, you know. And so like, what is the church in this weird post third industrial revolution? Like, what is the church? Because like growth just came naturally through this, but now you're saying growth came naturally in GDP growth, but now as GDP growth has slowed, you want the church to move into sorrow. Like, you know, sorrow and death, like, you know, which isn't resource escalation or growth or joy.
You're exactly right. It doesn't sound good, but you're exactly right. I mean, the first thing to say is like, I can have no friends. So everyone's going to be mad at me as they read this Bale book, because I do think that the way we become kind of resource obsessed, kind of open to fertility, if you will, to kind of capitalist fertility, is you kind of get two options within Protestantism. You become what Gordon calls a techno-optimist. And he says there are these people who just think huge amounts of growth are right around the corner. And they hate Gordon because he's like, it's not common, man. Like, it's not going to happen. But even today, if you talk, you could turn on 24-hour news and you'd hear some techno optimists being like, AI is going to bring it.
Right.
Once AI really gets distributed into society, it's going to change healthcare. It's going to change this. In 30 years from now, we will have no idea. This moment right now will look so old fashioned compared to where we are in 30 years. The problem, Gordon says, is we've been saying that for 20, 25 years,
Right.
This is going to change everything. Maybe it will happen, but he's doubtful that it will have like these great economic changes. So, but you see this within the church, is that there's techno optimists everywhere. Like, if we could just find the right way to preach, if we could just get the right program, if we could just help pastors learn to be innovators, think of their local communities in more entrepreneurial ways, then we would get the growth that would save us. But the other side of this is that the techno optimists and denominations usually have their enemies are the identitarians, as I
Right.
call them. And what I think is fascinating about identitarians is there's a lot of talk of kind of justice and things like that, which there's something legitimate about that. Just like there's something about creativity and the need to kind of get creative that the techno optimists are right about. Like we shouldn't be against those things. But there is a way, and this is kind of based off the sociologist named Castiles, who wants to talk about how in this third industrial revolution, that identity kind of gets disconnected from communities, and that it can be kind of recognition for identities can become a capitalist pursuit.
Right.
And I mean, he starts writing this on the early days, like in the late 90s of the kind of boom of the internet age. And really didn't see social media, but in social media, that's really it. Like it's a lot of identitarian talk to try to get recognition. And so I'm just trying to point out, and this is where I can have no friends, is that both tend to be very capitalistic,
Right.
like the techno optimists tend to be real friends with like capitalist forms. We need to escalate, but the identitarians try, like they'll give us some hardcore Marxist critiques of capitalism, but there is a kind of capitalist logic in here of what it means to kind of win recognition and which identities need to be affirmed and which don't, and how the debates work with that. And so I'm trying to point that out, and it's going to make everyone very angry with me. But I think both are very susceptible then to fertility gods and these kind of escalating capitalist forms, and thinking that stabilization is based on that. So we either got to find the right innovations, or we got to identify the right identities and affirm them without ever any end. And those are the only things that will save us. And I hear it all the time. I hear like no seminary will exist unless they move towards techno-optimism or move towards identitarianism, because you won't have any resources. You'll either have no students or no donors, or one or the other. And you start to see why Baal is really attractive. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
No, because again, it goes like everything pushes for more within us. Like, I got to grow my brand, and what does it mean to have a podcast,
Right.
And do I want to see it grow? Yeah. Yes. Like, would I love to make some money from it? Sure. But like, what, if that becomes my goal, I can manipulate something, or, figure out the algorithms to, maybe get more hits. But is that the way of Jesus?
Right. And you can even see that with affirmation. Like, what is affirmation for? Like, what's the end? Is there a larger story? Like, it is really about the upholding of humanity and finding community and belonging with others? Or is it just about kind of winning attention? And this is what's really hard, is in an attention economy, the objective is just to win more and more and more attention. And this is Castile's point, is like, this becomes a very capitalist game. Like, you're just always driving for more and more and more. So I am trying to move towards the theology of the cross, because I move in every way towards the theology of the cross. And The evangelism book is kind of trying to think of evangelism through the theology of the cross. And in some sense, this book is trying to think of church growth, if you will, through the theology of the cross, which becomes no church growth at all in some sense, or it becomes a growth into the logic of the cross, which is to experience God in experiences of brokenness and loss, and the church becoming the community that consoles the brokenhearted.
Right.
And my big wager is God is present in those moments.
Yeah.
And this does go back to the story of Israel. Like, God hears the suffering of Israel, and God sends and elects Moses in to set the people free, free from the traps of continued escalation. And I think in the cross, in the same way, ends all drives towards kind of maintaining ourselves by our performance, and really says that God is present and can meet us in those places where we need others to bear our humanity, to be with us in our sorrow, and that our sorrow has fundamental value in the sense that it becomes the place where our neighbor is called to share in it with us. That's not to glorify when I have my own sorrow. It's just bad. It's just awful and loss. But it does, and this is something Bonhoeffer, I think, says really beautifully, is that kind of building off Luther, this kind of sense of Anfachtung, which is this kind of sense of loss. And it's really the temptation that God isn't good because you're in the midst of just difficult human experiences, that creates a center that Jesus Christ is present at, and it calls others to join in it. And I really want to push the church and Christian leaders to be really attentive to where God is present. And that's where I find Luther's theology of the cross so helpful, is that it really is a commitment that God is present here. God can be present in other ways too, but God is primarily the one who is pro me, is for you. And so in the midst of your sorrow and brokenness, God is for you. And the church is to say to the world, God is for you. God is with and for you, not when you're escalating.
Right.
And not when you've worked hard enough to earn it, but particularly when you found your work doesn't get you anywhere. Like when you find that you are broken and unable to perform or get yourself out, this God who is so for you comes near. And those are what I'm trying, the kind of the tones I'm trying to hit, which exists. I mean, they exist still with mothers and their children.
Right.
And that's why I think the iconography of Mary and Jesus are so profoundly important for us.
Because that relational push, is because even evangelism, can be used for instrumental means of like, well, we just, hey, if you do the right things and get more people in there, like it's growth. And I think most pastors that I've interacted with will be like, well, no, I always prioritize the relational. Like, no, we're about this for people. We're in the people business. We're not in the growth business. But our actions don't, or, they may negate or belie what we actually say at times.
Yeah.
But your call is to share in the sufferings of other. Like, how do we be more relational? And that's like, it's a fine line. It feels like it's like, it's not either or black or white. It feels like, but it's this fine line that, it's a tightrope.
Yeah, it is. And familial analogies I think are helpful. I mean, like, to think you're not a good parent, you're not a good dad, you're not a good mom if you don't care about sustainability, or you don't care about, if you don't care about your family having a future. There's a responsibility. Part of the office of being a parent is thinking about, how are we going to get to the end of the year? How are we going to get to the end of the month? How do we sustain this? The question just that becomes, is it only dynamically? Is it only growth of capital that does that? And I think, this is the question. What sustains us is a question of salvation. So it's like a fundamental theological question, because I think this will happen in churches where some people will say, okay, Pastor, that's great that you care about that God stuff, but we need the adults just to worry about how we're going to get the budget passed. You know what I mean? Like, we just need more money, as if that, as if the theological spiritual realities are one place and that just the pure finances are another place. But these things are deeply interconnected, because they are stories of what saves, what makes us long for the world? What continues to give us a home, a place to belong that we can hold together? So it isn't zero sum where it's like, don't think about this. As a matter of fact, like what comes after this, Andrew, is that, especially finishing the Baal book, it's like, now I need to talk about what money is, because every pastor has to deal with money.
Right.
And every parent has to think about balancing some budget for the good of the embrace of their child. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so that's what's coming next. I don't, maybe in about a year it's completed, but it's in production.
Wow.
About kind of thinking of a pastoral theology of money itself, because every American pastor is a bit of, you're running a small business, whether you like it or not. So at that level, it's like, so I don't want to fall into this logic of escalation and completely serve the God of dynamic stabilization that comes as, capital in our late modern form. But what do I do with money? Like, how do I even think about money theologically? So that's the kind of next move. So you're right. I'm just trying to say there's something really important about money, but all the more so we have to think about it theologically and how it then moves us. I mean, this is the little teaser to the next book, how money itself becomes a relational dynamic. Money is relational in and of itself and not just an instrument. And that's the kind of through line of all my work, is I just fear modernity turns everything into instruments and then therefore instrumentalizes everything. And I just don't think the God of Israel, the God known in Jesus Christ, is about instrumentality, but about deep forms of relationality that all the traditions have called this. I mean, sacramentality is a deep relationality.
Right.
Theosis in the Eastern tradition is a deep one. In the Trinitarian traditions, hypostasis is like this. These are never instruments. These are what it means to be caught up. I mean, Pentecost is being caught up in the Spirit. These are not just instrumental realities. And yet I think what modernity does is instrumentalize everything. So I'm trying to go to every form of ministry and trying to cast out the demon of instrumentalization, if you will.
I think it's valid. And I think, to draw it back to my wine work, I work for a small wine distributor. I don't have quotas to meet. The wineries we represent aren't saying you need to meet this quota, or like my company's not saying I need you to sell X amount of cases of a really bad wine because we're at, like I can go to my account, my clients, and be like, hey, what do you need? How can I serve you? Versus, I have friends that are with bigger companies and it's the end of the month and they're like, I need to sell $12,000 more or else I'm in trouble. Like, and again, like I want to see growth. I want to see more sales, but like, I'm hoping right or wrong that maybe caring about the relationship with my accounts or saying, hey, how can I serve you best? What do you need versus what does my company need might actually help and pay off in the long run. But it's slow and it's harder and it's more frightening.
Yeah.
But I hope that kindness pays, I can hopefully maybe sleep better at night. You know? And I think it goes well with that spiritual aspect too, of like, are we pushing something that the people don't need? Or are we asking and, our fellow brothers and sisters, okay, how can I serve you best? Where do you need to be met? Versus, hey, look at this shiny new toy we got that might get more people in the seats.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I'll have to be back on when this money book comes out and we can talk about it, because I think there's an interesting dynamic where some of these anthropologists are trying to flip the story we have about how money got created.
Okay.
And we tend to think like with Adam Smith that kind of money comes for the sake of stand-in interest. Like you're interested in this and I'm interested in that. So if we turn it into that interest into kind of coin, then we don't have to actually correlate our interests, So, but there's a lot of these anthropologists that are talking about that money, when you actually see it in society, comes about because of human relationships, where this kind of sense of promise is made. That, I make a promise to you, you make a promise to me. Money can sometimes tragically come in to stand in for broken promise, but you can see the deeper relational dynamic of promise. And even with, your clients, there's a sense of the relationality makes a kind of promise. Like I promise that I will, get you the best wine I can get you at a fair price. Right. And, you make promises to me about actually paying your the debts that we have.
Right.
But there's something core about promise where really Adam Smith's story, God bless Adam Smith, is really trying to get human relationality out of it so markets can just grow.
Right.
And yet that's really maybe not the greatest way to think about it.
So has capitalism ruined everything?
I'm not an anti-capitalist, just
right.
like I'm not a degrowth person.
Okay.
So I'm not that, but I will say that I do think that there's something true, something that's the best we can do in some ways is a certain kind of capitalist forms. I'm not an anti-capitalist, but I do really worry about late form capitalism. And particularly kind of hyper-fiscal forms of capitalism. And we're a long ways away from Max Weber in the sense of interest and what it means to do good business and faithfulness to God and your neighbor when we're talking about what it means to sell debt to big corporations and, make money. And then how we all become kind of pulled in. Like my 401k is completely wrapped up in how the markets do.
Yeah.
And yet people who are in poverty have no access to those markets.
Right.
So, and so they have no participation in the circulation of money whatsoever.
Yeah.
And my future, like literally my retirement is dependent on those markets going up. And there's a huge percentage of people who have no access to that. And it's very different than the way Augustine thought about the alms, and we thought we have to give alms. And one of the reasons we have to give alms is because it allows people, the poor, to be involved in the circulation of money. And we've created a kind of fiscal capitalism that's eliminated the poor from the circulation of money. And I worry about that. But at its core, I'm not against capitalism. Don't think capitalism has ruined everything. But I do think if you don't regulate the beast, it does. I'm not a big fan of neoliberal capitalism because I think it has a certain form of individualism to it that, and I have a high view. I have a low anthropology and therefore a high view that sin is rampant in the world, that unless we regulate it, that my interest, I know this from myself, from my own being, that my interest will become the most important thing. And I will talk myself into needing more and more and more and more and more because I'm afraid of my own finitude in many ways,
Yeah. And I think it's, maybe the American church's wholesale adoption of capitalism without critical examination of what are the issues and where, and again, I think that's where you're calling the church of what do we need to do. And so to wrap up, like, I'm curious, as a final question, like for the average person sitting in a pew, like, they're not a pastor, they're not, they're just trying to make sense. Like, what is you're not a pastor, but you're pastoral. Like, so what would be your pastoral exhortation to the average person sitting in a pew in this moment?
Yeah, well, I start the book and I end the book, and I'm too old to really do this, but with a meme, like what we think will save us, and it's a picture of Artemis, and then what will save us, and it's this beautiful icon of Our Lady of Vladimir, which is this beautiful picture I actually have on my screensaver right here of the Madonna of Mary kind of looking at you, the viewer, and inviting you into this relationship she has with this child, with the Christ child that's looking intently at her. And I guess what I would really say is that we do always have to reflect. And I think there's something very Protestant on this, is what we think saves us. And Calvin, I think, is right that the human heart is in a factory of idols. And we've made ours very sophisticated ones. But it is a question, I think, of what do we think will save ourselves, but also what do we think will save the church? And that I do, my wager, it's relationality over its instrumentality. And but that's costly. That's actually costly, because there is a foolishness in it, to quote Paul. It looks utterly foolish to think this crucified Nazarene and this teenage girl and her baby can save you, as opposed to the great god Artemis or the bull that's reared back on Wall Street. Like there is just an utter. I guess I would say to the person sitting in the pews, like, what does it mean to take faith in the utter absurdity of the crucified, the crucified Christ, as opposed to the bull on Wall Street? I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's Baalism in our day, is all those tourists around the Wall Street bull.
Mm.
And, people don't know it, but they're taking pictures of their of their idol. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we all do.
Yeah. Love those words. I was also thinking in your book of, I watched live stream the Global Leadership Summit a few times when Bill Hybels was still doing it. And he would always say the church is the hope of the world. And then would bring in, Fortune 500 CEOs to tell us how to make the church a better way, and again, it's an instrumentality versus where you're asking us to embrace the absurdity. Again, it's not going to get you invited to the big conferences, but it's what the invitation of the cross is.
Yeah. And it is amazing to think that if Jesus was doing that, a la Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, he would say, the church is the hope of the world, and then bring, a 6-year-old up there and like stand with them and, become like one of these if you would like to enter my kingdom. Is very different than, optimize and learn to innovate or, do all the things that the CEO or the great activist does. But what does it mean to be like this child?
Yep. So I appreciate this, Andy. I've always loved your work and appreciate the chance to converse and draw out some ideas. If people want to find you, where can they, find your work?
If people really want to escalate my, my social media handles, performative contradiction completely.
I know.
Probably, it's the world we live in, right? Yep. Like we both said, we're not anti-capitalist. No. We're just trying to stay out of the teeth of it. But I have a website that's andrewroot.org, and that's probably the best place to go. So people can find me there.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, do pick up Baal and the Gods of More. I think it is a fascinating look at where we are today and what the church is called to. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.